Indeed, Bongani, the sun has set in Harare, which means that perhaps the end of an era of Zimbabwe's history is upon us. We've got about 58 minutes left for the polls to close, and then after that, the people of Zimbabwe will have decided. It's been quite a day, and somebody who's been watching it as well as us is Professor David Moore from the University of Johannesburg. Thanks very much for joining us. These are quite remarkable times that we've lived through, and today these elections have felt really, really different from previous ones.
Well, yes, and as you and I were discussing before, from the 1980s, I was here first in 1984, and those were the utopian days. The economy was good. We didn't know about Gukurahundi very much, and I think this is an election which is comparable to 1980 in many ways. It's a new dawn, or the second new dawn since the coup in November, and people really have high expectations of some serious change.
What's the sense that you get about what might have happened today?
Well, I was at a few polling stations, and I had colleagues in the rural areas. Very long queues, so it looks like there's going to be a big turnout. There will be a high turnout. No violence, although I've heard some stories of some violence in Mashonaland, which are basically internal ZANU-PF, the old G40, the new Patriotic Front. They were pretty slow at beginning, sort of more than 4 minutes, but then they speeded up towards the end, 2 minutes average time. People were getting a bit restless, but I think that we won't have to delay another day like we did in 2002. And I got the impression myself from speaking to people here and other people outside that there's a lot of hope for some really serious change, especially among the youth.
So tell me, I spoke to some of these youth and moms with babies, and you know, they were saying that they think that this vote really is going to change their lives, and I kept on wondering, is it possible that these parties have promised too much?
Well, in a sense, I don't think people were listening to the economic policies. I mean, the MTC Alliance, we'd have to grow at 17.4% a year to reach their goals. And we have all the claims of $20 billion in promises from the Mnangagwa side. I'm not sure if people pay that much attention to those details. In a sense, there's kind of a religious element of a revival. ZANU-PF talks about resurrection. They have Bishop Lazarus writing in the Herald. So there is a sense of renewal and resurrection, although people really, really are desperate for economic change. And there hasn't been much change in the past few months because I suppose the donors and the international community have told Mnangagwa, you have to have a free and fair election. So there's sort of a carrot and a stick, the carrot being heavily indebted debt reduction, even though Zimbabwe doesn't really qualify, all those sorts of things. Which are promised. And of course, whoever comes into power, they're going to have to deal with the IMF, the heavy structural adjustments that are going to take place. How many civil servants are you going to have to fire? What about the informal sector? Informal sector people are saying, look, we need startup capital. The banks aren't loaning us money. It's very expensive. We don't have collateral. What sort of... But anyway, that's going to be afterwards. I think today people are just very hopeful, very glad that it's peaceful, and they hope that if their expectations aren't met, they won't have to go out onto the streets tomorrow or in the next 3 days.
Who do you think are going to be the biggest influence of this election? A lot of the times we talk about the rural-urban vote, but 60% of those voters are under 40, which means they've only ever really lived in Zimbabwe and watched its challenges over time.
Yeah, they weren't around when we were around in the 80s. And it's interesting too, I think a lot of the youth are in rural areas because the unemployment has been so bad in the cities. And since Operation Murambasina and so on, many more have been moving back to the rural areas. So whereas 2013, 2008, we might have been seeing abandoned villages with old people and frightened people. But I think if we're seeing youth in the rural areas, they won't be that frightened. And of course we have the social media, which is incredible. So you have a lot of interaction between the rural areas and the cities, and the families, of course, like Zimbabwe has always been. There's been incredible interaction between rural and urban areas. So the rural thing might benefit ZANU-PF. They have had structures there for years, and even in the peri-urban areas. The MDC came into this after Morgan Tsvangirai's death, and Nelson Chamisa kind of coming in very quickly, patching together the alliance, which is basically made up of parties which abandoned the MDCT because they were unhappy with Morgan Tsvangirai or for whatever reason. How solid that alliance will be in the future, whether they win or lose, is an open question. So, but then again, if we look at the sort of the former G40 people, I mean, we had Emerson Mnangagwa saying at these primaries, look, we've got people there who are against me. They might want to impeach me. What are they going to do about those people? So there are still those factions. And of course, Robert Mugabe has come on saying, well, you know what?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, as we do with these things, but we're going to have lots of time once the polls have closed. But thanks very much indeed for your initial insights, Professor David Moore. All right, so that's where we're going to leave it for the time being. Thanks for tuning in here in Harare. As I said, the sun has set. We've got 52 minutes left before the polls close. And then after that, well, the Zimbabweans have decided their fate and their future, and they're pinning their hopes on whoever they voted for. We'll start catching up with you as soon as the polls close and start getting some of those results, because the counting will happen almost immediately. Back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter Ndor, of course, senior SABC anchor in Harare there. The sun has set in Harare. You could also say the sun has set certainly on the Mugabe era. Whichever way you look at it, there's certainly going to be change in Zimbabwe going forward. We'll keep you, of course, updated with all that's happening in Harare, in Bulawayo. We've got an excellent team that's been giving us extensive coverage of this election. Stay with us. You're watching The Full View.